In the late 1400s, medieval England stood as a land of castles, knights, and powerful kings. What happens when a child must wear the heavy crown of a kingdom? Can a boy of only 10 years old truly rule a nation filled with ambitious lords and restless common folk? The story of Richard II answers these questions through triumph, tragedy, and betrayal. Today, we journey through the complete tale of one of England's most fascinating monarchs. We will explore his rise, his reign, and his heartbreaking fall. This is the entire story of Richard II. Edward of Woodstock, known to history as the Black Prince, was one of the most celebrated warriors of his age. He was the eldest son of King Edward III and Queen Philippa of Hainault. Born in 1330 at Woodstock Palace, he showed from an early age the qualities that would make him famous. He was brave, skilled in combat, and blessed with a natural talent for leadership. His father doted on him and gave him every advantage that a prince could desire. The nickname Black Prince was not used during his lifetime. It appeared in later centuries, and historians still debate its origin. Some say it came from the colour of his armour. Others suggest it referred to the terror he inspired in his enemies. Whatever the source, the name captures something of his fierce reputation. He was a man who showed no mercy on the battlefield. His enemies learned to fear the sight of his banner. Edward received the education expected of a royal prince. He learned to read and write in French, the language of the English court. He studied Latin and perhaps some English as well. He was trained in the arts of war from a young age. Riding, swordsmanship, and the use of the lance were all part of his daily routine. He also learned about governance and diplomacy. A future king needed to understand how to rule as well as how to fight. At the age of 16, the Black Prince fought in his first major battle. This was the Battle of Crécy in 1346. King Edward III had invaded France to press his claim to the French throne. The French army greatly outnumbered the English, but the English had a secret weapon. Their longbowmen could shoot arrows with devastating accuracy and speed. The French knights charged again and again, only to be cut down by storms of arrows. Young Edward fought bravely in the thick of the battle. At one point, his situation became desperate, and some urged the king to send help. Edward III reportedly replied that his son must win his spurs. The prince survived and earned glory that day. 10 years later, the Black Prince won his greatest victory at the Battle of Poitiers. Leading an English army in France, he found himself facing a much larger French force. The French king, John II, commanded his troops personally. The battle was fierce and bloody. English archers once again proved their worth, but it was the courage and tactical skill of the Black Prince that carried the day. The English not only won the battle, but captured the French king himself. This was an astonishing achievement. The ransom for King John would fill English coffers with gold. The Black Prince treated his royal captive with remarkable courtesy. He served the French king at dinner and showed him every respect. This chivalrous behaviour enhanced his reputation throughout Europe. He was seen as the perfect knight, brave in battle but gracious in victory. Songs were sung about his deeds. His name became a byword for martial excellence. He seemed destined for greatness, a future king who would lead England to even greater glory. In 1361, the Black Prince was created Prince of Aquitaine. This large region in southwestern France was English territory, and Edward was sent to rule it. He established his court at Bordeaux, the principal city of the region. Here he lived in considerable splendour, surrounded by knights and nobles who had followed him from England. He administered justice, collected taxes, and maintained order in his vast domain. It was in Aquitaine that he would meet the woman who would become his wife. Joan of Kent was one of the most beautiful women in England. She was also one of the most controversial. Her marital history was complicated and scandalous. She had been secretly married to one man while publicly married to another. The Pope himself had to sort out the mess. By the time she met the Black Prince, she was a widow with children. She was also the prince's cousin. Despite these obstacles, Edward was determined to marry her. He sought and obtained the necessary permissions. The wedding took place in 1361. The marriage of Edward and Joan was by all accounts a happy one. They genuinely loved each other, which was rare in an age of arranged marriages. Joan accompanied her husband to Aquitaine and shared in the challenges and pleasures of ruling. She was intelligent and capable, a true partner to the prince. Together, they would have 2 sons. The first, Edward, was born in 1365. The second, Richard, arrived on January 6, 1367, at the Abbey of St. Andrew in Bordeaux. The birth of Richard took place during the Feast of the Epiphany. This Christian holiday celebrates the visit of the Magi to the infant Jesus. It was considered a lucky day for a royal birth. The baby was healthy and strong. His parents rejoiced at his arrival. They could not know that this child would one day wear the crown of England. At the time of his birth, Richard was not expected to become king. His father, the Black Prince, was heir to the throne. His older brother, Edward, stood next in line. Richard was merely a spare, an insurance policy against the uncertainties of medieval life. Young Richard spent his early years in Aquitaine. The warm climate of southwestern France was pleasant compared to the damp chill of England. The prince's household was large and luxurious. Richard was surrounded by servants, tutors and attendants. He began his education at an early age. Like his father, he learned French and Latin. He was taught to ride and to handle weapons. But Richard also showed interests that set him apart from his warrior father. He loved music and poetry. He appreciated beautiful objects and fine craftsmanship. These artistic inclinations would shape his character throughout his life. The Black Prince's health began to fail in the late 1360s. He had contracted a mysterious illness during a military campaign in Spain. Some historians believe it was dysentery or a similar disease. Others suggest it may have been a form of cancer. Whatever the cause, the prince grew weaker with each passing year. He could no longer lead his troops in battle. He struggled to fulfill his duties as ruler of Aquitaine. The man who had once been the terror of France was reduced to a shadow of his former self. Tragedy struck the family in 1371. Young Edward, Richard's older brother, died at the age of 6. The cause of his death is unknown. Perhaps it was plague or some other disease. The loss devastated his parents. The Black Prince, already weakened by illness, seemed to decline further. Joan of Kent mourned deeply for her firstborn son. Little Richard, now just 4 years old, suddenly found himself in a new position. He was now the heir to his father's titles and expectations. If the Black Prince became king, Richard would be next in line for the throne. The Black Prince returned to England in 1371. He was too sick to continue governing Aquitaine. The sea voyage must have been difficult for a man in his condition. Back in England, he lived quietly, no longer able to participate in the great events of the realm. His father, King Edward III, was also ageing and increasingly unwell. The glory days of the English monarchy seemed to be fading. The great victories of Crécy and Poitiers were memories now. The war in France was going badly. English territories on the continent were shrinking. Richard came to England with his parents. He was introduced to the land that would one day be his kingdom. England must have seemed different from sunny Aquitaine. The weather was cooler and wetter. The landscapes were greener. The people spoke English, a language that Richard would need to learn. He met his grandfather, the old king, and his many uncles. The royal family was large and complex. Richard would need to navigate its rivalries and alliances for the rest of his life. The education of a prince continued in England. Richard had tutors who taught him everything a future ruler needed to know. He learned about history and law. He studied the Bible and the writings of the Church Fathers. He practiced the skills of horsemanship and combat. But he also pursued his artistic interests. He learned to appreciate fine art and beautiful music. He developed a taste for elegant clothing and luxurious surroundings. These preferences would later attract criticism from those who thought a king should be more warlike. The Black Prince died on June 8, 1376. He was only 45 years old. His death was mourned throughout England. He had been a national hero, the embodiment of English military prowess. His funeral was a grand affair, befitting his status. He was buried in Canterbury Cathedral, where his tomb can still be seen today. Above it hangs his helmet, his shield, and his surcoat. These relics remind visitors of the warrior prince who once struck fear into the hearts of his enemies. Richard was now 9 years old. With his father's death, he became heir to the throne of England. His grandfather, Edward III, was old and frail. Everyone knew that the king did not have long to live. Richard's position was both privileged and precarious. He was surrounded by powerful uncles who had ambitions of their own. John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, was the most powerful of these uncles. He was wealthy, influential, and experienced in government. Some whispered that he wanted the throne for himself. King Edward III died on June 21st, 1377. He had reigned for 50 years, one of the longest reigns in English history. His death marked the end of an era. The old king had seen England rise to greatness and then begin to decline. He had outlived his most capable son. Now the crown passed to a child. Richard II became King of England at the age of 10. A boy would sit on the throne of one of the most powerful kingdoms in Europe. The coronation of Richard II took place on July 16th, 1377. It was a magnificent ceremony, designed to impress upon everyone the sacred nature of kingship. The young king was anointed with holy oil, symbolizing God's blessing on his reign. He received the crown, the orb, and the scepter, the ancient symbols of royal authority. He swore oaths to protect the church and to govern justly. The nobles of England knelt before him and pledged their loyalty. Richard was now king in name and in law, but a 10-year-old boy could not actually rule a kingdom. A council of nobles was established to govern in Richard's name. This council was supposed to guide the young king until he came of age. In practice, it became a battleground for competing factions. Richard's uncles jockeyed for position and influence. John of Gaunt was the most prominent, but he was also the most controversial. Many people distrusted him. They feared he would use his power for his own benefit rather than for the good of the realm. Richard's mother, Joan of Kent, remained an important figure in his life. She was known as the Fair Maid of Kent, a reference to her legendary beauty. Though no longer young, she still commanded respect at court. She tried to protect her son from the worst of the political intrigues. She counselled him and comforted him. Her presence provided some stability in a turbulent time. Richard loved his mother deeply, and her eventual death would affect him greatly. The young king showed signs of the character he would display throughout his reign. He was intelligent and quick-witted. He had a strong sense of his own dignity and authority. He did not like to be contradicted or challenged. He could be charming when he wished, but he could also be cold and distant. He formed strong attachments to certain individuals and rewarded them generously. He also held grudges and never forgot a slight. These traits would bring him both devoted followers and bitter enemies. The kingdom that Richard inherited was facing serious problems. The war with France was going poorly. English armies had suffered defeats, and English territory was shrinking. The cost of the war was enormous, requiring heavy taxes that burdened the common people. The Black Death had disrupted the economy and society. Labour was scarce, and workers were demanding higher wages. The old feudal system was breaking down. Discontent was spreading among the peasants and the urban poor. All of these problems would come to a head in the early years of Richard's reign. Richard's court began to take shape in these early years. The young king gathered around him a group of favourites who would influence his reign. Some of these men were capable and loyal. Others were self-serving and corrupt. The king's household grew in size and expense. Richard developed a taste for luxury that would later attract criticism. He loved fine clothes, beautiful jewellery, and elegant furnishings. His court became known for its splendour and its sophistication. This was a departure from the more martial atmosphere of his grandfather's reign. The first years of Richard's reign passed relatively peacefully. The council governed the kingdom, while the king grew and learned. Richard participated in ceremonies and rituals that reinforced his authority. He met with ambassadors and received petitions. He began to understand the complexities of ruling a kingdom, but he was still a boy, dependent on the adults around him. Real power lay with the council and with his powerful uncles. Richard chafed at these limitations. He was eager to rule in his own right. Education continued to be an important part of Richard's life. He had access to books and manuscripts that few people could afford. He read widely in history, philosophy, and theology. He was particularly interested in the nature of kingship. He studied the examples of great rulers from the past. He developed ideas about royal authority that would shape his reign. Richard came to believe that kings were God's representatives on earth. He thought that royal power should be absolute and unquestioned. These beliefs would bring him into conflict with his nobles and his parliament. The young king also developed his artistic sensibilities during these years. He patronised painters, sculptors, and craftsmen. He commissioned beautiful objects for his palaces and chapels. He supported poets and musicians. His court became a centre of cultural activity. Richard himself may have had some artistic talent. He certainly had a keen eye for beauty. This cultural patronage was not merely a personal indulgence. It was also a way of displaying royal magnificence and impressing both subjects and foreign visitors. As Richard approached his teenage years, pressure mounted for him to take a more active role in government. The council system was proving inadequate. Factions within the council fought among themselves. Decisions were delayed or poorly implemented. The war with France continued to drain resources. Discontent was growing among the common people. Something needed to change. The young king would soon have an opportunity to prove himself. A great crisis was approaching that would test Richard's courage and his judgment. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 would thrust the teenage king into the centre of events and reveal both his strengths and his weaknesses. The early years of Richard's reign were marked by uncertainty and tension. A child sat on the throne of England, surrounded by ambitious nobles who sought to control him and the kingdom. The council that governed in his name was riven by rivalries and disagreements. Meanwhile, the common people of England grew increasingly restless. The burdens they bore were becoming unbearable. The stage was being set for one of the most dramatic events in medieval English history. The financial situation of the kingdom was dire. The war with France required constant infusions of money. Armies had to be paid, ships had to be built, and fortresses had to be maintained. The traditional sources of royal income were not sufficient to meet these needs. Parliament had to be summoned again and again to grant new taxes. Each time, the members of Parliament demanded something in return. They wanted a say in how the money was spent. They wanted reforms in the government. The relationship between the Crown and Parliament was becoming increasingly contentious. The poll tax was introduced as a way to raise money for the war. Unlike other taxes, which were based on property or income, the poll tax was a flat fee charged to every adult in the kingdom. The first poll tax, in 1377, charged 4 pence per person. This was a significant sum for poor people. The second poll tax, in 1379, was graduated based on social rank. The third poll tax, in 1380, returned to a flat rate but tripled the amount to 12 pence per person. This was an enormous burden on the poor. It would prove to be a catastrophic mistake. The collection of the poll tax in 1381 sparked resistance throughout England. Many people simply refused to pay. They hid from the tax collectors or gave false information about the number of people in their households. The government responded by sending out commissioners to investigate and enforce collection. These commissioners were often harsh and intrusive. They entered homes and questioned families. They used threats and violence to extract payment. The resentment of the common people grew with each passing day. The situation was particularly explosive in the southeastern counties of England. Essex and Kent were densely populated regions with strong traditions of independence. The people here were not willing to submit meekly to what they saw as unjust taxation. They began to organise and to talk of resistance. Local leaders emerged who gave voice to the anger of the common folk. The spark that would ignite the rebellion was about to be struck. In late May of 1381, a tax commissioner named John Bampton arrived in the Essex village of Fobbing. He was there to investigate reports of tax evasion. The villagers refused to cooperate. They drove Bampton and his men out of the village. This act of defiance quickly spread to neighbouring communities. Within days, much of Essex was in open revolt. The rebels began to march, gathering supporters as they went. They attacked the homes of unpopular officials and destroyed tax records. The uprising had begun. Across the Thames in Kent, a similar rebellion was taking shape. The catalyst here was an incident in the town of Dartford. A tax collector allegedly assaulted the daughter of a local man named Wat Tyler. Tyler killed the collector in retaliation. Whether this story is true or not, Wat Tyler emerged as one of the principal leaders of the revolt. He was a charismatic figure who could inspire and organise the angry crowds. Under his leadership, the Kentish rebels became a formidable force. The rebels had grievances that went far beyond the poll tax. They resented the entire system of serfdom that bound them to the land. They were angry about laws that kept wages low and restricted their freedom of movement. They felt that the government was corrupt and that the nobles were exploiting them. They wanted fundamental changes in the way society was organised. Some of them dreamed of a world where all men would be equal, where there would be no more lords and serfs. These radical ideas gave the revolt a revolutionary character. John Ball was a priest who became one of the ideological leaders of the revolt. He had been preaching radical ideas for years, calling for social equality and condemning the wealth of the church. He had been imprisoned multiple times for his inflammatory sermons. The rebels freed him from prison and made him one of their spokesmen. Ball preached to the crowds, using vivid language and memorable phrases. His most famous saying was a rhyming couplet that asked when Adam delved, and Eve span, who was then the gentleman. This simple question challenged the entire basis of the feudal social order. The rebels from Essex and Kent converged on London in early June. They numbered in the tens of thousands. Many of them were armed with whatever weapons they could find. Bows, axes, knives, and farm tools. They were angry and determined. The government was caught completely off guard. There was no army in place to stop the advancing hordes. The nobles who might have organised resistance were scattered across the country. London lay virtually defenceless before the rebel host. Young King Richard was at the Tower of London when the rebels arrived. He was just 14 years old. With him were his mother, Joan of Kent, and several of his councillors. The tower was a strong fortress, but it could not hold out indefinitely against such numbers. The king and his advisers had to decide what to do. Some counselled negotiation, others urged the king to flee. Richard chose to face the rebels directly. It was a decision that would define his early reign. On June 13th, Richard attempted to meet with the rebels at Rotherhithe on the south bank of the Thames. He travelled by royal barge, accompanied by a small group of nobles and officials. The crowds on the shore were enormous and agitated. Richard's advisers feared for his safety and refused to let him land. The barge turned back, leaving the rebels frustrated and angry. That night, they vented their rage on London. They broke into the city and began a rampage of destruction. The rebels targeted specific enemies. They attacked the Savoy Palace, the magnificent London residence of John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster. Gaunt was hated by the common people, who blamed him for the failures of the government. The rebels systematically destroyed the palace, burning its contents and demolishing its walls. They were careful not to steal anything, wanting to show that they were seeking justice, not plunder. Anyone caught looting was killed by his fellow rebels. The destruction of the Savoy was a powerful symbol of popular anger against the ruling class. Other targets included the temple, the headquarters of the legal profession. The rebels burned legal documents and killed several lawyers. They saw the law as a tool of oppression, used by the powerful to exploit the weak. They also attacked foreigners, particularly Flemish merchants, who had settled in London. Dozens of Flemings were murdered in the streets. The violence was indiscriminate and terrifying. London was in chaos. The next day, June 14th, Richard rode out to meet the rebels at Mile End, just outside the city walls. This time, he actually met with them face to face. It was an extraordinary scene, a teenage king confronting a vast crowd of angry peasants. Richard showed remarkable courage. He listened to their demands and agreed to many of them. He promised to abolish serfdom and to pardon all those who had taken part in the revolt. Clerks began writing out charters of freedom on the spot. Many of the rebels, satisfied with these concessions, began to disperse and head home. But the crisis was not over. While Richard was at Mile End, another group of rebels broke into the Tower of London. They found and killed several of the king's most hated ministers, including Simon Sudbury, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and Lord Chancellor, and Robert Hales, the Lord Treasurer. The rebels dragged these men to Tower Hill and beheaded them. Their heads were displayed on London Bridge. The murder of such high-ranking officials was a shocking escalation. It showed how completely the normal order had broken down. The following day, June 15th, Richard met with the rebels again at Smithfield, just outside the city walls. Wat Tyler came forward to present the rebels' demands directly to the king. The exact details of what happened next are disputed. Tyler apparently behaved disrespectfully toward the king. He may have threatened Richard or made some aggressive gesture. The Lord Mayor of London, William Walworth, drew his sword and struck Tyler down. Tyler was mortally wounded and soon died. The rebels were stunned. Their leader had been killed before their eyes. For a moment, it seemed that they might attack the king and his small retinue. The situation was incredibly dangerous. Thousands of armed and angry men faced a handful of nobles and guards. One wrong move could have resulted in a massacre. The young king's life hung in the balance. What happened next would become one of the most famous moments in English history. Richard rode forward alone toward the rebel host. He was just 14 years old, a slender boy on horseback facing a sea of hostile faces. He raised his hand and called out to them. His words rang across the field. He told them that he would be their leader. He told them that they should follow him. He promised that they would have all they desired. It was an astonishing display of courage and presence of mind. The rebels hesitated. Then slowly they began to follow the young king away from Smithfield. Richard led the rebels toward Clerkenwell, away from the scene of Tyler's death. His quick thinking had diffused an explosive situation. The nobles used this time to organize. They gathered armed men and began to restore order. The rebel host gradually dispersed. Some went home, believing that the king's promises would be kept. Others were rounded up and arrested. The immediate crisis was over. London was saved from further destruction. The boy king had proven himself in the most dramatic way possible. The aftermath of the revolt was harsh. Richard's promises made at Mile End and Smithfield were quickly revoked. Parliament declared that the charters of freedom were invalid because they had been granted under duress. The leaders of the revolt were hunted down and executed. Wat Tyler was already dead. John Bull was captured, tried and hanged. Hundreds of rebels across the country met similar fates. The dream of social equality was crushed. Serfdom continued, though it would gradually fade away over the coming decades. Richard's role in suppressing the revolt has been debated by historians ever since. Some see his actions at Smithfield as genuinely heroic. A young king risked his life to save his followers and restore peace. Others are more cynical. They point out that Richard's promises were false, made only to buy time. The rebels trusted him and were betrayed. Whatever the truth, the Peasants' Revolt had a lasting impact on Richard's character. He had seen the common people rise up against their betters. He had witnessed the murder of his ministers. He would never forget the danger that popular unrest could pose to royal authority. The revolt also revealed the weakness of the government. The nobles and councillors had been unable to prevent the uprising or to suppress it effectively. It was the young king himself who had saved the day. Richard drew certain conclusions from this experience. He came to believe that he needed to strengthen royal power. He could not rely on his nobles to protect him. He would have to build his own base of support, loyal to him personally rather than to any faction or interest. These ideas would shape his policies in the years to come. The years immediately following the Peasants' Revolt were relatively quiet. Richard was still young, and the council continued to govern in his name. But the king was growing up. He was becoming more assertive and more interested in exercising real power. He began to chafe at the restrictions placed upon him. He resented the interference of his uncles, particularly John of Gaunt. He wanted to rule as well as reign. The stage was being set for the next great crisis of his reign. Richard's personality was becoming more defined during these years. He was intelligent and cultured, with a genuine appreciation for art and literature. He was also proud, sensitive, and quick to take offence. He formed intense attachments to certain individuals and showered them with gifts and honours. He expected absolute loyalty in return. Those who displeased him could find themselves suddenly out of favour. Richard could be charming and gracious, but he could also be cold and vindictive. He was not an easy man to serve. The king's favourites became increasingly prominent at court. Robert de Vere, Earl of Oxford, was the most important of these. Richard adored de Vere and elevated him to unprecedented heights. He made him Marquess of Dublin and then Duke of Ireland, titles that had never before been granted to anyone outside the royal family. The king's generosity to de Vere aroused jealousy and resentment among the other nobles. They saw a young man of modest abilities being raised above his betters simply because he had the king's affection. Michael de la Pole was another of Richard's favourites. He was an older man, experienced in government and diplomacy. Richard made him Chancellor of England and later Earl of Suffolk. De la Pole was more capable than de Vere, but he too attracted criticism. The nobles suspected that he was enriching himself at the expense of the kingdom. They blamed him for the failures of English policy in France. The war was going badly, and someone had to be held responsible. The war with France continued to drain English resources. English armies achieved little success on the continent. French forces raided the English coast, burning towns and spreading fear. The great victories of Edward III and the Black Prince seemed like distant memories. The government needed money to continue the war, but Parliament was reluctant to grant new taxes. The members of Parliament wanted reforms and accountability. They wanted to know how their money was being spent. The tension between the Crown and Parliament was growing. The mid-1380s brought Richard II into direct conflict with some of the most powerful nobles in England. The king was now in his late teens, eager to rule in his own right, and resentful of those who tried to limit his authority. His favourites, particularly Robert de Vere and Michael de la Pole, had become lightning rods for criticism. The stage was set for a constitutional crisis that would define the middle years of Richard's reign. Michael de la Pole had served as Chancellor since 1383. He was responsible for the day-to-day administration of the government. Under his leadership, the war with France had gone poorly. English armies had achieved little success. Money had been spent with seemingly little to show for it. The nobles in Parliament were angry. They wanted someone to blame for the failures. De la Pole was the obvious target. The Parliament that met in October 1386 was in an ugly mood. The members demanded that de la Pole be removed from office and put on trial. Richard refused. He declared that he would not dismiss even a kitchen servant at Parliament's request. This was a dramatic assertion of royal prerogative. The king was claiming that he alone had the right to choose his ministers. Parliament had no authority to interfere. The confrontation escalated rapidly. A delegation of nobles came to Richard at Eltham Palace. They reminded him of a statute from the reign of Edward II, his great-grandfather. That statute provided that if a king refused to attend Parliament, he could be deposed. The implication was clear. If Richard did not cooperate, he might suffer the same fate as Edward II, who had been forced from the throne and murdered. It was a chilling threat. Richard backed down. He agreed to attend Parliament and to allow de la Pole to be impeached. The Chancellor was charged with various offences, including mismanagement of funds and failure to prosecute the war effectively. He was found guilty and removed from office. His lands were confiscated, though his life was spared. It was a humiliating defeat for the king. He had been forced to sacrifice one of his closest advisers to the demands of his enemies. Parliament did not stop with de la Pole's impeachment. It established a commission to oversee the government for the next year. This commission had sweeping powers. It could review royal expenditures, appoint officials, and reform the administration. Richard was effectively sidelined. He was still king in name, but real power had passed to the commission. It was a drastic limitation on royal authority, and Richard deeply resented it. The king spent the following months plotting his revenge. He travelled around the country, staying away from London and the watchful eyes of his enemies. He consulted with his remaining supporters and sought legal opinions on his situation. He asked the royal judges whether the commission was lawful and whether Parliament had the right to impose such restrictions on the king. The judges told him what he wanted to hear. They declared that the commission was illegal and that those who had promoted it were traitors. Armed with these legal opinions, Richard prepared to strike back. But his enemies were not idle. They learned of the king's consultations with the judges. They realised that Richard was planning to move against them. They decided to act first. In November 1387, 3 great nobles formally accused Richard's favourites of treason. These nobles were Thomas of Woodstock, Duke of Gloucester, who was Richard's youngest uncle, Richard Fitzalan, Earl of Arundel, and Thomas de Beauchamp, Earl of Warwick. They became known as the Lords Appellant because they appealed or accused the king's friends of treason. The accusations were sweeping. Robert de Vere, Michael de la Pole, Robert Tressilian, the Chief Justice, Nicholas Brembre, the former Mayor of London, and Alexander Neville, the Archbishop of York, were all named as traitors. They were accused of misleading the king, enriching themselves at public expense, and plotting to destroy the great nobles of the realm. The Lords Appellant demanded that these men be brought to trial before Parliament. Richard tried to resist. He summoned Robert de Vere to raise an army in his support. De Vere gathered forces in the northwest of England and marched toward London, but the Lords Appellant had their own army. The two forces met at Radcock Bridge in Oxfordshire on December 20th, 1387. The battle was brief and decisive. De Vere's army was routed. The favourite himself barely escaped with his life, fleeing across the river and eventually making his way to the continent. He would never return to England. The defeat at Radcock Bridge left Richard defenceless. The Lords Appellant marched on London with their victorious army. They confronted the king at the Tower of London. For 3 days, Richard's fate hung in the balance. The appellants discussed whether to depose him. Some apparently favoured this course, but they could not agree on who should replace him. John of Gaunt was still abroad. His son, Henry Bolingbroke, was one of the appellants, but he was young and untested. In the end, they decided to leave Richard on the throne, but to strip him of any real power. 2 more nobles had joined the original 3 appellants. Henry Bolingbroke, Earl of Derby, was the son of John of Gaunt and Richard's first cousin. Thomas Mowbray, Earl of Nottingham, was another powerful magnate. Together, the 5 Lords Appellant dominated the government. They controlled access to the king. They appointed their own men to key positions. They prepared for the Parliament that would try the accused traitors. The Merciless Parliament, as it came to be known, met in February 1388. It was one of the most dramatic assemblies in English history. The Lords Appellant presented their accusations against the king's favourites. The charges were read out in detail. The defendants were given little opportunity to respond. The outcome was predetermined. This was not a fair trial, but a political purge. Robert de Vere and Michael de la Pole had both fled the country. They were condemned in absentia, and their lands were confiscated. De Vere was stripped of all his titles. He would die in exile a few years later, killed in a hunting accident. De la Pole also died abroad, never seeing England again. Their flight probably saved their lives, but it meant permanent separation from their homeland and their king. Those who remained in England fared worse. Robert Tresilian, the Chief Justice, was found hiding in sanctuary at Westminster. He was dragged out and executed. Nicholas Brember, despite his services to the City of London, was also put to death. Simon Burley, Richard's former tutor, and a man the king loved dearly, was condemned despite Queen Anne's tearful pleas for mercy. His execution particularly wounded Richard. He never forgave those responsible. The merciless Parliament continued for months, rooting out anyone connected to the king's inner circle. Lesser figures were executed, imprisoned, or exiled. The royal household was purged. Richard was surrounded by men chosen by his enemies. He was watched constantly, unable to act without the appellant's approval. It was the lowest point of his reign. The proud young king was reduced to a puppet, going through the motions of royalty while others held real power. Richard learned important lessons during this terrible time. He learned to hide his true feelings behind a mask of compliance. He learned patience, the ability to wait for the right moment to strike. He learned to identify his enemies and to remember their offences. He stored up his grievances, nursing them in secret, waiting for the day when he could take revenge. That day would come, but it was still years away. The Lords Appellant gradually relaxed their grip on power. They had achieved their immediate goals. The king's favourites were dead or exiled. The government was in their hands. They saw no need to maintain their coalition indefinitely. Personal rivalries and disagreements began to surface. The unity that had made them so formidable started to crack. Richard watched and waited, looking for opportunities to exploit their divisions. John of Gaunt returned to England in 1389. His presence changed the political dynamics. Gaunt was the most powerful noble in the kingdom, far wealthier and more experienced than any of the appellants. He had no love for his youngest brother Gloucester, or for Arundel and Warwick. He was willing to support his nephew the king against these rivals. His return gave Richard a powerful ally and a counterweight to the appellants. In May 1389, Richard made his move. He appeared before the council and asked how old he was. He was told he was 22. Richard then declared that he had been under the control of others long enough. He was now of full age and would rule in his own right. He dismissed the ministers appointed by the appellants and chose his own men. The Lords Appellants were caught off guard. They had no legal basis to resist. Richard had reclaimed his throne without shedding a drop of blood. The king's declaration of personal rule marked the beginning of a new phase in his reign. For the next 8 years, Richard would govern England with relative success. He would pursue peace with France, patronise the arts, and maintain a magnificent court. He would also never forget what the Lords Appellant had done to him. He bided his time, waiting for the moment when he could take his revenge. That moment would come in 1397, and when it did, Richard would show no mercy. The years of Richard's personal rule were among the most successful of his reign. The king was now a mature man, experienced in the ways of power, and determined to govern effectively. He had learned from his earlier mistakes. He was more cautious in his choice of favourites, more careful in his dealings with Parliament, more attentive to the concerns of his nobles. For 8 years, England enjoyed relative peace and stability under his leadership. Richard's first priority was to end the ruinous war with France. The conflict had dragged on for decades, consuming vast resources and achieving little. English territory in France had shrunk dramatically. The great conquests of Edward III were mostly lost. Continuing the war seemed pointless. Richard believed that peace would benefit England far more than endless fighting. Negotiations with France began almost immediately after Richard assumed personal rule. The French king, Charles VI, was also eager for peace. His kingdom had suffered terribly from the war. Both sides were exhausted. The negotiations were long and complicated, involving issues of territory, sovereignty, and dynastic claims. But progress was made. In 1396, a long truce was agreed upon. It was not a final peace, but it brought an end to active hostilities. The truce with France was sealed by a royal marriage. Richard's beloved queen, Anne of Bohemia, had died in 1394. Her death devastated the king. He ordered the palace at Chien, where she had died, to be demolished. He could not bear to look upon the place where he had lost her. For 2 years, he remained a widower, mourning his loss. But political considerations eventually required him to remarry. Richard's second wife was Isabella of Valois, the daughter of the French king. She was only 6 years old when they married in 1396. This was a diplomatic union, not a love match. The marriage cemented the truce between England and France. It also raised the possibility of a permanent peace. If Richard and Isabella had children, those children would have claims to both thrones. The two kingdoms might eventually be united under a single ruler. The marriage ceremony took place near Calais in November 1396. It was a magnificent occasion, attended by nobles from both kingdoms. Richard treated his child bride with kindness and affection. He was genuinely fond of her, though their relationship was necessarily that of a guardian and ward rather than husband and wife. Isabella would remain in England after Richard's fall, eventually returning to France as a widow at the age of 11. Richard's court during these years was the most splendid England had ever seen. The king spent lavishly on buildings, furnishings, and entertainments. He employed hundreds of servants and retainers. His household consumed enormous quantities of food and drink. Visitors from abroad were impressed by the magnificence they witnessed. Richard was consciously modelling his court on those of France and Burgundy, the cultural leaders of Europe. The king's patronage of the arts reached its peak during this period. He commissioned the famous Wilton diptych, a portable altarpiece that is one of the masterpieces of medieval painting. He supported poets, musicians, and craftsmen of all kinds. Geoffrey Chaucer continued to enjoy royal favour. The Canterbury Tales, Chaucer's greatest work, was written during Richard's reign. The cultural achievements of this period would long outlast the political turmoil that surrounded them. Richard developed an elaborate court ceremonial that emphasised his majesty. He expected his subjects to kneel in his presence and to address him with exaggerated respect. He sat on a raised throne, looking down on those who approached him. He used the royal plural, referring to himself as we rather than I. Some saw these innovations as appropriate expressions of royal dignity. Others thought them pretentious and foreign. Richard was trying to elevate the monarchy above the factional struggles that had plagued his reign. The king's relationship with Parliament improved during these years. Richard summoned Parliament regularly and worked with its members to address the kingdom's problems. He was more willing to listen to criticism and to make concessions when necessary. The bitter conflicts of the 1380s seemed to be behind him. Parliament granted taxes without the acrimony of earlier years. The government functioned more smoothly than it had in a long time. Richard also worked to build a loyal following among the nobility. He created new peers and distributed patronage carefully. He rewarded those who had stood by him during his troubles and cultivated those who might be useful in the future. He was building a network of supporters who owed their positions to him personally. This was shrewd politics, but it also aroused jealousy among those who felt excluded from royal favour. The king's uncles played varying roles during this period. John of Gaunt remained the most powerful noble in England. He supported his nephew's policies and helped maintain stability. His presence deterred potential troublemakers. Edmund of Langley, Duke of York, was a less forceful personality. He generally went along with whatever the prevailing power wanted. Thomas of Woodstock, Duke of Gloucester, was more problematic. He had been one of the Lords appellant and remained hostile to Richard. The king watched him carefully, waiting for an opportunity to settle old scores. The former Lords appellant occupied an awkward position. They had humiliated the king and killed his friends. Richard had not forgotten or forgiven, but he could not move against them openly without risking another confrontation. So he waited. He treated them with outward courtesy while nursing his grievances in private. He looked for signs of disloyalty that might justify action against them. He was patient. He knew that his time would come. Richard's religious policies during these years were generally conventional. He supported the church and its hierarchy. He took action against the Lollards, the followers of John Wycliffe who challenged orthodox teachings. Several Lollards were burned for heresy during his reign, the first such executions in English history. Richard saw religious dissent as a threat to social order. If people questioned the authority of the church, they might also question the authority of the king. Ireland demanded attention during this period. English control over the island had weakened dramatically. The Gaelic Irish chiefs were expanding their territories at the expense of the English settlers. The colonists sent desperate appeals to the king for help. Richard decided to lead an expedition to Ireland in person. It would be the first visit by an English king in nearly 200 years. The Irish expedition of 1394 to 1395 was a major undertaking. Richard assembled a large army and crossed the Irish Sea. He spent several months in Ireland, receiving the submission of various Irish chiefs and trying to establish order. The expedition achieved some success. Several chiefs acknowledged Richard as their lord, but the gains proved temporary. As soon as the king left, the situation began to deteriorate again. Ireland would remain a problem for English rulers for centuries to come. Richard's second Irish expedition came in 1399, and it would have fateful consequences. But that story belongs to a later chapter. For now, we should note that Richard took his responsibilities in Ireland seriously. He genuinely tried to improve conditions there. He showed more interest in Ireland than most English kings before or after him. His efforts were ultimately unsuccessful, but they were not insincere. The Queen's death in 1394 cast a shadow over the later years of Richard's personal rule. Anne of Bohemia had been his companion and confidant for 12 years. She had softened his harsher impulses and interceded for those who had offended him. Without her moderating influence, Richard became more arbitrary and more vindictive. The restraint he had shown in the early years of his personal rule began to slip away. Richard's grief for Anne was intense and prolonged. He cursed the Earl of Arundel, who arrived late to her funeral and then asked permission to leave early. The king struck him and drew blood, a shocking breach of decorum. This incident revealed the depth of Richard's emotions and his inability to control them. It also showed his growing hostility toward the former appellants. Arundel had been one of his chief tormentors. Richard would not forget this latest insult. The king's behaviour became increasingly erratic after Anne's death. He was prone to sudden rages and unpredictable decisions. He showed favour to some and disfavour to others without apparent reason. His court became a place of anxiety, where no one knew what the king might do next. Some historians have suggested that Richard suffered from some form of mental illness. Others attribute his behaviour to the traumas of his reign and the loss of his beloved wife. Whatever the cause, the change in Richard's character was noticeable and disturbing. By 1397, Richard was ready to move against his enemies. He had waited nearly a decade since the merciless Parliament. He had built up his power and his resources. He had identified those he blamed for his earlier humiliation. Now he would have his revenge. The final act of his reign was about to begin. It would be marked by tyranny, betrayal, and ultimately, catastrophe. Anne of Bohemia holds a special place in the story of Richard II. She was his first wife, his companion through the most difficult years of his reign, and the love of his life. Her influence on Richard and on the English court was profound. To understand Richard fully, we must understand the woman who shared his throne for 12 years. Anne was born in 1366, the daughter of Charles IV, Holy Roman Emperor and King of Bohemia. Her family was one of the most prestigious in Europe. The Holy Roman Empire, despite its grand name, was a loose confederation of German-speaking territories, but the emperor held a position of great honour in the hierarchy of Christian rulers. Anne grew up in the sophisticated courts of Prague and other Bohemian cities. Prague in the 14th century was one of the great cities of Europe. Charles IV had transformed it into a centre of learning and culture. He founded the University of Prague, the first university in Central Europe. He built magnificent churches and palaces. He attracted scholars, artists and craftsmen from across the continent. Anne spent much of her childhood in the Hradschin Palace, surrounded by beauty and intellectual stimulation. This upbringing shaped her character and her tastes. Anne's mother was Elizabeth of Pomerania, the fourth wife of Emperor Charles. Elizabeth came from a noble family with connections to the Polish royal house. She was the granddaughter of Casimir the Great, King of Poland. Anne thus had royal blood on both sides of her family. She was raised to understand the responsibilities and privileges of her station. She learned languages, music, and the arts of courtly behaviour. She was prepared for the role she would eventually play as a queen. Anne had several siblings who would play important roles in European history. Her brother Wenceslaus became King of Bohemia and later King of Germany. Another brother, Sigismund, would eventually become Holy Roman Emperor himself. These family connections gave Anne a network of relationships across Europe. They also made her an attractive marriage prospect for any king seeking to strengthen his diplomatic position. The negotiations for Anne's marriage to Richard began in the early 1380s. England was looking for allies against France. The Holy Roman Empire seemed a natural partner. A marriage between Richard and Anne would cement an alliance between the two powers. The negotiations were complicated and prolonged. There were questions about the dowry, about the terms of the alliance, and about the logistics of bringing a Bohemian princess to England. The marriage contract was finally agreed upon in 1381. Anne would bring no dowry to the marriage. In fact, England agreed to pay a substantial sum to the emperor in exchange for the alliance. This unusual arrangement attracted criticism in England. Some thought the king was paying too much for a bride who brought nothing with her, but Richard was determined to have Anne. The political benefits of the alliance outweighed the financial costs. Anne travelled to England in late 1381. The journey was long and difficult. She crossed the German lands, passed through the Low Countries, and finally reached Calais on the French coast. From there, she sailed across the English Channel. The sea crossing was rough, and Anne arrived in England exhausted and seasick. But she had made it. She was about to meet the young king, who would be her husband. The wedding took place on January 20th, 1382, at Westminster Abbey. It was a magnificent ceremony, attended by the greatest nobles of England. Anne was 15 years old. Richard was also 15. They were both young, both nervous, both aware of the importance of the occasion. The Archbishop of Canterbury performed the ceremony. The vows were exchanged. Anne of Bohemia became Queen of England. The early years of the marriage were a time of adjustment. Anne had to learn English customs and the English language. She had to navigate the complex politics of the English court. She had to establish her household and build relationships with the nobles and ladies who surrounded her. It was not easy. She was a foreigner in a strange land, far from her family and everything she had known. But Anne proved equal to the challenge. She was intelligent, adaptable, and determined to succeed. She learned English quickly and became fluent in the language. She won the respect of the English nobles with her grace and dignity. She showed genuine interest in her new country and its people. Within a few years she had become a beloved figure at court. The English came to appreciate the qualities that made her special. Anne's relationship with Richard developed into a genuine love match. This was unusual in an age of arranged marriages. Most royal couples tolerated each other at best. Richard and Anne genuinely cared for each other. They spent time together, shared interests, and supported each other through difficulties. Richard relied on Anne's counsel and valued her opinions. She was not just his wife, but his partner and his friend. The Queen's influence on Richard was generally positive. She softened his harsher impulses and encouraged his better nature. When Richard was angry, Anne could calm him. When he was inclined to be vindictive, she urged mercy. She interceded on behalf of those who had offended the king, pleading for their forgiveness. Her interventions saved many people from punishment. She was known throughout England as a compassionate and merciful queen. Anne's intercession during the crisis of 1386 to 1388 was particularly notable. When the Lords Appellants were at the height of their power, Anne pleaded for the lives of the king's friends. She knelt before the appellants, begging them to spare Simon Burley, Richard's beloved former tutor. Her tears and prayers moved many who witnessed them. But the appellants were unmoved. Burley was executed despite her pleas. Anne never forgot this cruelty, and neither did Richard. The Queen brought Bohemian influences to the English court. Fashions from Central Europe became popular among the English nobility. The horned headdresses worn by ladies of the court were said to have been introduced by Anne and her Bohemian attendants. New styles of dress, new forms of entertainment, and new ideas spread through the court. Anne's presence made the English court more cosmopolitan and more connected to the wider European world. Anne was also associated with religious and intellectual movements. She brought books from Bohemia, including religious texts that would later influence the Lollard movement. Some historians have suggested that Anne had sympathies with reform ideas, though this is debated. What is certain is that her presence facilitated cultural exchange between England and Bohemia. Ideas flowed in both directions, enriching both countries. The Queen's household was a significant institution in its own right. Anne employed hundreds of servants, attendants, and officials. She had her own income from lands assigned to her as queen. She managed this household with skill and efficiency. She was a patron of artists and craftsmen. She supported charitable works and religious institutions. Her household was a centre of culture and refinement within the larger royal court. Anne and Richard shared a love of beauty and luxury. They commissioned magnificent works of art and architecture. They dressed in the finest clothes and surrounded themselves with beautiful objects. Their court was famous throughout Europe for its splendour. Some criticised this extravagance as wasteful, but Richard and Anne saw it as an expression of royal dignity. A great king should have a great court. Magnificence was a form of power. The Wilton diptych, one of the masterpieces of medieval art, was probably commissioned during Anne's lifetime. This small portable altarpiece shows Richard being presented to the Virgin Mary by his patron saints. The painting is exquisite in its detail and its use of colour. It reflects the sophisticated, artistic tastes of Richard's court. Anne may have been involved in its commission, though her exact role is unknown. Geoffrey Chaucer flourished under the patronage of Richard and Anne. The great poet held various positions in the royal government and received pensions from the crown. His masterpiece, The Canterbury Tales, was written during Richard's reign. Chaucer dedicated some of his works to the Queen. The literary flowering of this period owed much to the support of the royal couple. English literature was transformed during their reign. Anne's piety was well known. She attended Mass regularly and supported religious institutions. She went on pilgrimages to holy sites in England. She gave generously to the poor and to charitable causes. Her religious devotion was sincere and deep. It was one of the qualities that endeared her to the English people. They saw in her a model of Christian queenship. The one great sorrow of Anne's marriage was her failure to produce an heir. Despite 12 years of marriage, she and Richard had no children. This was a serious problem for the kingdom. Without an heir, the succession was uncertain. Richard's cousins and uncles waited in the wings, hoping that they or their descendants might inherit the throne. The lack of an heir made Richard's position more precarious and encouraged the ambitions of potential rivals. The reasons for Anne's childlessness are unknown. Medieval medicine had no understanding of fertility problems. People attributed such things to God's will or to moral failings. There is no evidence that either Richard or Anne was unfaithful or that their marriage was unhappy. They simply did not have children. It was a source of private grief and public concern. Anne's health began to decline in the early 1390s. The exact nature of her illness is unknown. She may have suffered from some chronic condition that gradually weakened her, or she may have been struck suddenly by an acute disease. The records are not clear. What is certain is that by 1394, Anne was seriously ill. The Queen died on June 7th, 1394, at the royal palace of Sheen. She was only 28 years old. Richard was at her bedside when she passed. His grief was overwhelming. He had lost the person he loved most in the world. The woman who had been his companion through triumph and disaster was gone. He would never fully recover from the blow. Richard's reaction to Anne's death was extreme. He cursed the palace of Sheen, where she had died. He ordered it to be demolished. He could not bear to look upon the place where he had lost her. The destruction of a royal palace was an extraordinary act, a measure of the depth of his grief. Sheen was razed to the ground. It would later be rebuilt by Richard's successor, but Richard himself never returned to the site. The funeral of Anne of Bohemia was a magnificent affair. Her body lay in state for 2 months before the burial. The funeral procession to Westminster Abbey was attended by the greatest nobles of England. Thousands of candles illuminated the ceremony. The cost was enormous, but Richard spared no expense. He wanted to honour his beloved wife with a funeral worthy of her memory. The Earl of Arundel arrived late to the funeral and then asked permission to leave early. Richard was furious. He saw this as a deliberate insult to Anne's memory. He struck Arundel and drew blood, a shocking breach of decorum in a sacred space. The incident revealed the intensity of Richard's emotions and his growing instability. It also deepened his hatred for Arundel, one of the Lords Appellant who had tormented him years before. Richard commissioned a magnificent tomb for Anne in Westminster Abbey. The tomb shows Richard and Anne lying side by side, their hands clasped together. It is a touching image of marital devotion. Richard intended to be buried beside his first wife when his own time came. The tomb can still be seen today, a monument to a love that transcended death. The years after Anne's death saw a change in Richard's character. Without her moderating influence, he became more arbitrary and more vindictive. The restraint he had shown during the years of his personal rule began to slip away. He was quicker to anger and slower to forgive. He trusted fewer people and suspected more. The loss of Anne removed a crucial check on his worst impulses. Anne of Bohemia left a lasting legacy in England. She was remembered as a good queen, compassionate and merciful. She had brought culture and refinement to the English court. She had supported artists and writers whose works would endure for centuries. She had loved her husband and been loved in return. In an age of political marriages and dynastic calculations, her relationship with Richard stood out as something genuine and rare. The culture of Richard's court extended beyond his relationship with Anne. Richard was a patron of the arts on a grand scale. He employed painters, sculptors, goldsmiths, and craftsmen of every kind. He commissioned works that glorified his reign and expressed his vision of kingship. His court was a centre of artistic innovation and cultural achievements. Architecture flourished under Richard's patronage. He undertook major building projects at Westminster Hall, transforming it into one of the grandest spaces in Europe. The hammer-beam roof of Westminster Hall, with its magnificent wooden angels, was constructed during his reign. It remains one of the finest examples of medieval architecture in England. Richard also built and improved other royal residences, creating spaces worthy of his conception of kingship. Richard's interest in his own image was intense. He commissioned portraits of himself, something unusual for English kings of this period. The famous portrait in Westminster Abbey shows Richard enthroned in majesty, wearing his crown and holding the orb and sceptre. It is one of the earliest realistic portraits of an English monarch. Richard wanted to be seen and remembered. He understood the power of images to shape perception. The king's household was enormous by the standards of the time. Hundreds of people served in various capacities, from great nobles to humble servants. The household consumed vast quantities of food and drink. It required constant supplies of fuel, cloth, and other necessities. Managing this complex organisation was a major administrative challenge. Richard employed skilled officials to keep everything running smoothly. Ceremony and ritual were central to Richard's conception of kingship. He developed elaborate protocols for approaching the royal presence. Visitors were expected to kneel and to use formal language. The king sat on a raised throne, looking down on those who came before him. These ceremonies emphasized the distance between the king and his subjects. Richard was not just a man, but a sacred figure, God's representative on earth. Richard's court attracted visitors from across Europe. Ambassadors, merchants, and travellers came to see the English king and his magnificent household. They were impressed by what they found. Richard's court rivaled those of France and Burgundy in its splendour. It was a showcase for English wealth and power. Richard used his court as a diplomatic tool, impressing foreign visitors with his magnificence. Music played an important role in court life. Richard employed musicians and singers who performed at feasts and ceremonies. He may have had personal musical interests, though the records are not clear. The Chapel Royal, the king's personal religious establishment, maintained high standards of musical performance. Sacred music was an important part of court worship. Literature flourished during Richard's reign. Geoffrey Chaucer was the greatest literary figure of the age, but he was not alone. John Gower, another important poet, also enjoyed royal patronage. The Gawain poet, author of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, was active during this period. William Langland's Piers Plowman, a major work of social criticism, was written during Richard's reign. It was a golden age of English literature. The English language itself was changing during this period. For centuries, French had been the language of the English court and aristocracy. English was spoken by the common people, but had little prestige. During Richard's reign, English began to gain status. Chaucer wrote in English rather than French. Parliament began to conduct some business in English. The language was evolving and growing, laying the foundations for the literary achievements of later centuries. Richard's court was also a place of political intrigue. Factions competed for the king's favour. Nobles sought offices, lands and honours. Rumours and gossip circulated constantly. Alliances formed and dissolved. The court was a dangerous place for those who fell out of favour. Richard's moods were unpredictable, and his anger could be devastating. Courtiers learned to watch their words and guard their actions. The king's favourites enjoyed enormous influence during their time in the sun. They received grants of land, titles and offices. They had access to the king that others lacked. They could make or break the careers of lesser men. But favour was fickle. Those who rose high could fall just as quickly. The fates of Robert de Vere and Michael de la Pole showed the dangers of royal favour. To be the king's friend was both a privilege and a peril. Women played important roles at Richard's court. The Queen was the most prominent, but other noble ladies also wielded influence. They managed households, arranged marriages, and participated in the social life of the court. Some women served as intermediaries, carrying messages and smoothing over conflicts. The court was not exclusively a male domain, even if men held most formal positions of power. The court moved frequently from place to place. Richard had numerous residences scattered across England. Westminster was the centre of government, but the king also spent time at Windsor, Eltham, Sheen, and other palaces. The court travelled with the king, a vast caravan of people, animals, and baggage. These movements were logistically complex and expensive, but they allowed the king to show himself to different parts of his realm and to escape the unhealthy conditions that could develop in any place occupied for too long. Hunting was a favourite pastime of the medieval aristocracy, and Richard was no exception. The royal forests were carefully managed to provide game for the king's sport. Deer, boar, and other animals were hunted with dogs and hawks. Hunting was not just entertainment, but a form of training for war. It developed the skills of horsemanship and weapon handling that knights needed in battle. Richard participated in hunts, though he was not known as an especially passionate hunter. Tournaments were another important form of aristocratic entertainment. Knights competed in jousting and other martial contests. These events were colourful spectacles with elaborate costumes and ceremonies. They were also dangerous. Injuries and even deaths were not uncommon. Richard attended tournaments and may have participated in some, but he was not renowned as a jouster. His interests lay more in the cultural than the martial aspects of court life. Feasting was central to medieval court culture. Great banquets brought together the king and his nobles in displays of wealth and hospitality. Elaborate dishes were served in multiple courses. Entertainment was provided between courses. Feasts marked important occasions such as coronations, weddings, and religious holidays. They were opportunities for the king to demonstrate his generosity and for nobles to display their loyalty. The cost of maintaining Richard's magnificent court was enormous. The royal household consumed a significant portion of the kingdom's resources. Critics complained that the king was spending too much on luxury and display. They wanted the money to be used for defence or other practical purposes. Richard dismissed these criticisms. He believed that a great king needed a great court. Magnificence was not a waste but an investment in royal prestige. Richard's conception of kingship was shaped by his experiences and his reading. He believed that kings were God's anointed representatives on earth. Royal authority came from God, not from the people or from Parliament. The king was above the law, not subject to it. These ideas were not unique to Richard, but he held them with particular intensity. They would bring him into conflict with those who believed that even kings had limits. The culture of Richard's court reflected his personality and his values. It was sophisticated, artistic, and ceremonial. It emphasized the majesty of kingship and the distance between the monarch and his subjects. It attracted talented people and produced lasting achievements, but it also bred resentment among those who felt excluded or exploited. The magnificence of Richard's court was both a strength and a weakness. It impressed some and alienated others. It would not save him when his enemies finally moved against him. The year 1397 marked a dramatic turning point in Richard's reign. For nearly a decade, the king had governed with relative moderation. He had worked with Parliament, maintained peace with France, and avoided open conflict with his nobles. But beneath the surface, Richard had never forgotten the humiliations of 1386 to 1388. He had never forgiven the Lords Appellants who had killed his friends and stripped him of power. Now at last he was ready to take his revenge. The first signs of trouble came in the summer of 1397. Richard invited the Duke of Gloucester, the Earl of Arundel, and the Earl of Warwick to a banquet. These three men had been the original Lords Appellant, the leaders of the coalition that had humiliated Richard a decade earlier. They came to the banquet unsuspecting. They thought the old conflicts were behind them. They were wrong. Gloucester was arrested at his home in Essex and taken to Calais, where he was held prisoner. Arundel and Warwick were also arrested and imprisoned. The arrests were sudden and unexpected. The three lords had no chance to organise resistance or to flee. Richard had planned carefully and struck without warning. The hunters had become the hunted. The Parliament that met in September 1397 was packed with Richard's supporters. The king had carefully managed the elections to ensure a favourable outcome. He had also brought a large armed force to Westminster, intimidating anyone who might oppose him. This was not a free Parliament, but a tool of royal vengeance. It would do whatever Richard demanded. The charges against the three lords were sweeping. They were accused of treason for their actions during the crisis of 1386 to 1388. The appeals they had brought against Richard's favourites were now turned against them. The very procedures they had used to destroy De Vere and de la Pole were used to destroy them. There was a grim symmetry to Richard's revenge. The Earl of Arundel was tried first. He defended himself vigorously, denying the charges and challenging the legality of the proceedings. But the outcome was never in doubt. He was found guilty and sentenced to death. On September 21st, 1397, Arundel was beheaded on Tower Hill. He died bravely, forgiving his executioner and commending his soul to God. Richard watched the execution from a nearby window. His enemy was dead at last. The Earl of Warwick was tried next. Unlike Arundel, Warwick did not resist. He threw himself on the king's mercy, confessing his guilt and begging for his life. His abject submission saved him from execution. Richard commuted his sentence to life imprisonment. Warwick was sent to the Isle of Man, where he would remain for the rest of Richard's reign. His lands and titles were confiscated. The Duke of Gloucester never stood trial. He died in custody at Calais before he could be brought to England. The official story was that he died of natural causes, but rumours immediately spread that he had been murdered on Richard's orders. These rumours were probably true. Gloucester was smothered with a featherbed, according to later accounts. Richard had eliminated his troublesome uncle without the inconvenience of a public trial. The destruction of the three original appellants was not enough for Richard. He also moved against the two younger appellants, Henry Bolingbroke and Thomas Mowbray. These two had joined the original three in 1387, though they had played lesser roles. Richard could not simply arrest them, as he had the others. Bolingbroke was the son of John of Gaunt, the most powerful noble in England. Mowbray was also well connected. Richard needed a pretext. The pretext came in the form of a quarrel between Bolingbroke and Mowbray. The two men accused each other of treason. Each claimed that the other had spoken disloyal words about the king. The dispute could not be resolved through normal legal procedures. Richard ordered a trial by combat. The two nobles would fight to the death, and God would reveal which one was telling the truth. The trial by combat was scheduled for September 1398, at Coventry. It was a great spectacle. Thousands of people gathered to watch. Bolingbroke and Mowbray appeared in full armour, ready to fight. The tension was enormous. But just as the combat was about to begin, Richard intervened. He stopped the fight and announced his judgment. Both men were to be exiled from England. Mowbray was banished for life. Bolingbroke was banished for 10 years. The exile of Bolingbroke was a fateful decision. Richard had removed a potential rival from the kingdom, but he had also created a dangerous enemy. Bolingbroke was popular and well-connected. He had friends and supporters throughout England. His exile aroused sympathy and resentment. Many people thought Richard had treated him unjustly. The seeds of future conflict were being sown. John of Gaunt died in February 1399. He had been the richest and most powerful noble in England. His death removed a restraining influence on Richard. It also raised the question of what would happen to Gaunt's vast estates. By law they should have passed to his son, Henry Bolingbroke. But Bolingbroke was in exile. Richard saw an opportunity. Richard extended Bolingbroke's exile from 10 years to life. He then confiscated the Lancastrian estates, taking them for the crown. This was a shocking violation of the laws of inheritance. If the king could seize the lands of one noble family, he could seize the lands of any. No one's property was safe. The nobility watched with alarm. Richard was attacking the very foundations of the social order. The Parliament of 1397 to 1398 had granted Richard extraordinary powers. It had delegated its authority to a small committee that would continue to act in Parliament's name. This committee was controlled by Richard's supporters. It gave the king the ability to make laws without summoning a full Parliament. Richard had effectively made himself an absolute ruler. Richard used his new powers to reward his friends and punish his enemies. He created new nobles loyal to himself. He distributed lands and offices to his supporters. He imposed heavy fines on those who had opposed him. He required nobles to seal blank charters that could be filled in later with whatever obligations Richard chose. The kingdom lived in fear of the king's displeasure. The king's behaviour became increasingly erratic. He was suspicious of everyone, seeing plots and conspiracies everywhere. He surrounded himself with armed guards. He demanded expressions of loyalty that bordered on worship. He spoke of himself in grandiose terms, comparing himself to the greatest rulers of history. Some thought he was losing his mind. Others thought he was simply drunk on power. Richard's tyranny alienated even those who had supported him. The nobles who had helped him destroy the appellants began to have second thoughts. They realized that they too could become victims of royal caprice. The king who had rewarded them today might destroy them tomorrow. Trust in Richard evaporated. People began to look for alternatives. The king's religious policies during this period were conventional but intense. He promoted the cult of Edward the Confessor, the saintly king who had ruled England before the Norman conquest. Richard saw himself as Edward's spiritual heir. He visited Edward's shrine at Westminster and sought the saint's intercession. He may have hoped that association with a royal saint would strengthen his own claims to sacred authority. Richard also continued to support the persecution of Lollards. Several heretics were burned during his reign. The king saw religious dissent as a threat to social order. If people questioned the authority of the church, they might also question the authority of the king. Orthodoxy and obedience went together. Richard would tolerate no challenges to established authority, whether religious or political. The summer of 1399 found Richard preparing for another expedition to Ireland. The situation there had deteriorated since his first visit. The gains he had made in 1394 to 1395 had been lost. The Gaelic Irish chiefs were again expanding at the expense of the English settlers. Richard felt he had to intervene personally. It was a fateful decision. Richard sailed for Ireland in late May 1399. He took a substantial army with him. He also took many of the nobles he distrusted, wanting to keep them under his eye. He left his uncle Edmund of Langley, Duke of York, as regent in England. York was an ineffective man, unlikely to cause trouble but also unlikely to handle a crisis. Richard did not expect a crisis. He was wrong. While Richard was in Ireland, Henry Bolingbroke landed in England. The exiled Duke had gathered a small force and crossed the Channel. He claimed he had come only to reclaim his inheritance, the Lancastrian estates that Richard had seized, but his intentions were almost certainly broader. He had come to challenge the king. Bolingbroke landed in Yorkshire in early July 1399. He was greeted by supporters who flocked to his banner. The Earl of Northumberland and his son Henry Percy, known as Hotspur, joined him with their forces. Other nobles followed. Within weeks Bolingbroke had assembled a formidable army. The kingdom was slipping from Richard's grasp. The Duke of York, left in charge of England, was paralysed by indecision. He had neither the will nor the resources to resist Bolingbroke. He eventually submitted to the invader, joining his cause. The royal government collapsed. Officials fled or switched sides. Richard's carefully constructed regime crumbled with astonishing speed. News of Bolingbroke's invasion reached Richard in Ireland. The king was shocked and furious. He had not expected such a challenge. He prepared to return to England immediately, but the winds were against him. His fleet was delayed for weeks. By the time Richard finally landed in Wales, it was too late. His kingdom had already fallen. Richard landed at Milford Haven in late July. He found that most of his supporters had deserted him. His army had melted away. The nobles he had trusted had gone over to Bolingbroke. He was virtually alone. The king who had ruled England for 22 years was now a fugitive in his own realm. Richard retreated to Conwy Castle in North Wales. He still had a small group of loyal followers. He hoped to rally support and resist Bolingbroke, but his position was hopeless. The Earl of Northumberland came to negotiate. He promised that Richard would be allowed to remain king if he surrendered. Richard believed him. It was a trap. Richard left Conwy Castle and rode to meet Bolingbroke at Flint Castle. When he arrived, he found himself surrounded by Bolingbroke's army. He was a prisoner. The promises made by Northumberland were worthless. Richard had been deceived. His reign was effectively over. Bolingbroke brought Richard to London as a captive. The fallen king was lodged in the Tower of London, the fortress where he had once sheltered during the Peasants' Revolt. The wheel had come full circle. The boy who had faced down the rebels at Smithfield was now a prisoner in the same building. His fate was in the hands of his enemies. Ireland occupied a peculiar place in the medieval English realm. It was technically a lordship of the English crown, but English control was limited and contested. The story of Richard's involvement with Ireland reveals much about his character and his reign. It also played a crucial role in his downfall. The king's absence in Ireland created the opportunity for Henry Bolingbroke to seize the throne. English involvement in Ireland dated back to the 12th century. In 1171, King Henry II had invaded the island and established English lordship. Norman barons had carved out territories for themselves, building castles and establishing manors. For a time, it seemed that Ireland might be fully absorbed into the English realm. But the conquest was never completed. The Gaelic Irish proved resilient. They adapted to the new military realities and learned to resist the invaders. The English colony reached its greatest extent in the 13th century and then began to contract. The Black Death hit the English settlers particularly hard. Many died and others fled back to England. The Gaelic chiefs took advantage of the weakness to reclaim lost territories. By Richard's time, English control was largely confined to a small area around Dublin known as the Pale. This region was protected by fortifications and maintained close ties with England. Beyond the Pale, the situation was chaotic. Some areas were controlled by Gaelic chiefs who acknowledged no English authority. Other areas were held by the descendants of the original Norman settlers, who had adopted Irish customs and become more Irish than English. The English government called these people the degenerate English and viewed them with suspicion. The English settlers in Ireland constantly appealed to the Crown for help. They complained that they were surrounded by enemies and neglected by the government in London. They wanted money, soldiers, and attention. But Ireland was far away, and its problems seemed less urgent than those closer to home. English kings generally ignored Ireland, leaving the settlers to fend for themselves. Richard took a different approach. He was genuinely interested in Ireland and determined to restore English authority there. His motivations were complex. He wanted to fulfill his responsibilities as Lord of Ireland. He wanted to demonstrate his power and his ability to project force. He may also have wanted to escape the political pressures of England and find a theatre where he could act freely. The first Irish expedition took place in 1394 to 1395. Richard assembled a large army, perhaps the largest English force ever sent to Ireland. He crossed the Irish Sea in October 1394 and landed at Waterford. He would spend the next several months campaigning across the island. Richard's strategy combined military force with diplomacy. He led his army against those who resisted and offered terms to those who submitted. Many Gaelic chiefs chose to submit rather than face the English army. They came to Richard's camp, knelt before him, and acknowledged him as their lord. They promised to pay tribute and to keep the peace. Richard received them graciously and confirmed them in their lands. The most dramatic submission was that of Art MacMurrough, the King of Leinster. MacMurrough was one of the most powerful Gaelic chiefs, a fierce warrior who had long resisted English authority. Richard pursued him relentlessly, driving him from his strongholds. Eventually, MacMurrough agreed to submit. He came to Richard's camp and performed the ritual of submission. It was a significant achievement for the English king. Richard spent Christmas 1394 in Dublin. He held court in the city, receiving submissions and dispensing justice. He tried to reform the administration of the colony and to improve relations between the English settlers and the Gaelic Irish. He showed genuine concern for the welfare of all his Irish subjects, not just the English. This was unusual for an English king. The expedition achieved considerable success. Many chiefs had submitted. The authority of the English crown had been reasserted. Richard had demonstrated that he could project power across the Irish Sea. He returned to England in May 1395, satisfied with what he had accomplished. But the gains would prove temporary. The situation in Ireland deteriorated after Richard's departure. The submissions he had received were not permanent. Many chiefs resumed their independent ways as soon as the English army was gone. Art MacMurrough, who had submitted so dramatically, was soon in rebellion again. The English settlers complained that nothing had really changed. They demanded that the king return. Richard's second Irish expedition came in 1399. The timing could not have been worse. The king was at the height of his tyranny in England. He had alienated many of his nobles. He had created dangerous enemies. Leaving England at such a moment was extremely risky. But Richard was determined to go. He felt he had unfinished business in Ireland. The second expedition was smaller than the first. Richard did not have the resources for another massive army. He took perhaps 6,000 men, a substantial force but not overwhelming. He also took many nobles with him, partly to keep them under his control, and partly because he needed their military support. Richard landed in Ireland in late May 1399. He immediately faced difficulties. Art MacMurrough was in open rebellion, raiding English settlements and defying royal authority. Richard led his army against the Irish chief. But MacMurrough refused to give battle. He retreated into the forests and bogs where the English could not follow. It was a frustrating campaign. The news from England was alarming. Henry Bolingbroke had landed in Yorkshire. The kingdom was in turmoil. Richard faced an impossible choice. He could stay in Ireland and continue his campaign against MacMurrough, or he could return to England and confront Bolingbroke. Either choice carried enormous risks. Staying in Ireland meant leaving England to his enemies. Returning to England meant abandoning his Irish campaign in failure. The terrain of Ireland worked against Richard at every turn. The mountains, forests and bogs did not suit large armies. MacMurrough knew this land intimately. He used it to his advantage. The English soldiers struggled through difficult ground, while Irish warriors harassed them constantly. Richard forced thousands of local peasants to cut paths through the woods for his army. He burned houses and destroyed crops, trying to force MacMurrough into submission. But the Irish chief remained elusive. MacMurrough's tactics were simple but effective. He refused open battle against the larger English force. Instead, he relied on raids, ambushes, and scorched earth. His men attacked English supply lines and picked off stragglers. They appeared suddenly, struck hard, and vanished into the wilderness. The English army grew frustrated and exhausted. Morale began to suffer. Richard was fighting an enemy he could not catch. The king spent roughly 4 weeks traversing Leinster and the uplands of Wicklow, seeking his enemies. He pushed deep into hostile territory, determined to bring MacMurrough to heel. But the Irish chief always stayed one step ahead. The forests swallowed him up. The bogs protected him. Richard's great army accomplished little despite its size and strength. The difficulties Richard faced were not merely military. His soldiers sank into quagmires up to their middles. Hidden gullies and fallen trees blocked their path. The Irish continually attacked and killed great numbers of his men. Disease spread through the camp. Supplies ran short. The expedition that had begun with such confidence was turning into a disaster. MacMurrough had good reasons for his rebellion. After Richard's first expedition, promises had been made and then broken. An annuity of 80 marks and his wife's inheritance in the barony of Nora had been taken away. MacMurrough declared he would not make peace until these were restored. His grievances were real, and they fueled his resistance. He was fighting not just for independence, but for what he considered justice. The Earl of Gloucester, Richard's uncle Thomas of Woodstock, had served as an envoy during negotiations with MacMurrough. But Gloucester was now dead, murdered on Richard's orders. The relationships that might have facilitated peace no longer existed. Richard had destroyed too many bridges. He had made too many enemies. Now he was paying the price. By late June, Richard moved on to Dublin. He had achieved nothing substantial in his campaign against MacMurrough. The Irish chief remained undefeated and defiant. The English settlements remained vulnerable. The situation was no better than when Richard had arrived. In some ways it was worse. The king had demonstrated that even a royal army could not subdue the Gaelic Irish. The news from England grew more alarming with each passing day. Bolingbroke was gathering support. Nobles were flocking to his banner. The Duke of York, left in charge of the kingdom, had proven unable to resist. The royal government was collapsing. Richard's enemies were seizing control. Every day the king remained in Ireland. His position in England grew weaker. Richard finally decided to return to England. He could not ignore the threat Bolingbroke posed. Ireland would have to wait. The king gathered his forces and prepared to cross the Irish Sea. But the winds were against him. His fleet was delayed for precious weeks. Time that Richard desperately needed was slipping away. Bolingbroke used this time to consolidate his position. The delay was catastrophic. By the time Richard finally sailed, Bolingbroke controlled most of England. The nobles who might have supported Richard had already submitted to his rival. The army Richard had brought to Ireland was tired and depleted. It was in no condition to fight a civil war. The king was returning to a kingdom that had already rejected him. Richard landed at Milford Haven in Wales in late July. He hoped to find support among the Welsh, who had traditionally been loyal to the crown, but even here his position was weak. Most of his army had dispersed. His supporters had fled or surrendered. The king, who had ruled England for 22 years, found himself almost alone. The Irish expedition of 1399 was a turning point in Richard's reign. It removed him from England at a critical moment. It gave Bolingbroke the opportunity to strike. It exhausted Richard's military resources and demoralised his supporters. The campaign against MacMurrough had failed, and that failure contributed to a much greater disaster. Richard's throne was slipping away. Ireland itself would suffer from Richard's fall. The letter sent by the Irish Council to Henry IV described a land in danger of final destruction. There were no soldiers for defence and no money to engage new ones. The brief period of royal attention was over. Ireland would return to neglect. The problems Richard had tried to address would continue for centuries. Art MacMurrough survived and thrived. He continued to resist English authority until his death around 1416 or 1417. He had defeated 2 royal expeditions and maintained his independence. His success demonstrated the limits of English power in Ireland. The Gaelic recovery that Richard had tried to reverse continued unabated. Richard's Irish expeditions reveal much about his character. He was willing to take on difficult challenges. He showed personal courage in leading his armies. He tried to find solutions to problems that other kings had ignored. But he also showed poor judgment. He left England at dangerous moments. He underestimated his enemies. He overestimated his own abilities. These flaws would prove fatal. The contrast between Richard's 2 Irish expeditions is striking. The first, in 1394 to 1395, achieved considerable success. Many chiefs submitted. English authority was reasserted. Richard returned to England in triumph. The second expedition, in 1399, was a disaster. MacMurrough remained undefeated. Richard's army accomplished nothing, and while the king was away, he lost his throne. The timing of the second expedition was particularly unfortunate. Richard had just completed his campaign of revenge against the Lord's appellant. He had alienated much of the nobility. He had seized the Lancastrian estates, threatening the property rights of every landowner in England. This was precisely the wrong moment to leave the kingdom. But Richard went anyway. His obsession with Ireland blinded him to the dangers at home. Some historians have wondered why Richard chose to go to Ireland in 1399. The situation there was serious but not critical. The English colony had survived worse. There was no urgent need for royal intervention. Perhaps Richard wanted to escape the tensions of England. Perhaps he genuinely believed he could succeed where he had failed before. Perhaps he simply misjudged the situation. Whatever his reasons, the decision proved catastrophic. The Irish expeditions also highlight the limitations of medieval military power. Even a king of England, with all his resources, could not subdue a determined enemy fighting on favourable terrain. MacMurrough's guerrilla tactics neutralised Richard's advantages in numbers and equipment. The forests and bogs of Ireland were more powerful than any army. This lesson would be learned again and again in the centuries to come. Richard's relationship with Ireland was more complex than simple conquest. He showed genuine interest in the welfare of all his Irish subjects, not just the English settlers. He tried to integrate the Gaelic chiefs into the English system rather than simply destroying them. He offered terms and accepted submissions. This approach was more sophisticated than the brutal methods of some later English rulers. But it was not enough to solve Ireland's problems. The legacy of Richard's Irish expeditions is mixed. He was the only English king to visit Ireland between 1210 and 1689. His personal involvement showed that the crown took Ireland seriously, but his expeditions achieved no lasting results. The Gaelic recovery continued. The English colony continued to shrink. Ireland remained a troubled and troublesome part of the English realm. As Richard sailed back to England in the summer of 1399, he must have known that his situation was desperate. The kingdom he had ruled for more than 2 decades was slipping from his grasp. The enemies he had made were closing in. The revenge he had taken on the Lord's appellant had not made him secure. It had only created new enemies and alienated old friends. The final act of his reign was about to begin. The summer of 1399 witnessed one of the most dramatic reversals in English history. Richard II, who had ruled England for 22 years, lost his throne in a matter of weeks. Henry Bolingbroke, the exiled Duke of Lancaster, returned to England and seized power with astonishing speed. The fall of Richard was swift, complete, and irreversible. Henry Bolingbroke had been in exile since 1398. Richard had banished him for 10 years following the quarrel with Thomas Mowbray. When John of Gaunt died in February 1399, Richard extended the exile to life and seized the Lancastrian estates. This was the final provocation. Bolingbroke would not accept the loss of his inheritance. He began planning his return. Bolingbroke gathered supporters on the continent. He had friends and allies in France and the Low Countries. He assembled a small force, perhaps no more than a few hundred men. It was not an army capable of conquering a kingdom, but Bolingbroke was gambling that he would find support once he landed in England. He was right. The timing of Bolingbroke's invasion was carefully chosen. He waited until Richard had sailed for Ireland. With the king absent and the kingdom in the hands of the ineffective Duke of York, the moment was perfect. Bolingbroke set sail in late June 1399. He landed at Ravenspur in Yorkshire on or around July 4th. Yorkshire was friendly territory for Bolingbroke. The Lancastrian estates were concentrated in the north of England. The people there remembered John of Gaunt and felt loyalty to his son. They resented Richard's seizure of the Lancastrian lands. When Bolingbroke appeared, they rallied to his cause. Within days he had gathered a substantial following. The Earl of Northumberland was one of the first great nobles to join Bolingbroke. Henry Percy, the powerful Lord of the North, brought his military strength to the cause. His son, also named Henry Percy, and known as Hotspur, joined as well. The Percys were one of the most important families in England. Their support gave Bolingbroke credibility and military power. Bolingbroke initially claimed that he had come only to reclaim his inheritance. He said he had no designs on the throne. He wanted only what was rightfully his, the Lancastrian estates that Richard had seized. This claim was probably disingenuous. Bolingbroke must have known that challenging the king so directly would lead to a struggle for the crown itself, but the limited claim helped him gather support. Many people who would not have joined a rebellion were willing to support a man seeking justice. The Duke of York faced an impossible situation. He had been left in charge of England with inadequate resources and unclear authority. He tried to raise an army to resist Bolingbroke, but few responded to his summons. The nobles who might have fought for Richard were either in Ireland with the king or unwilling to risk their lives for an unpopular cause. York's position crumbled rapidly. York eventually submitted to Bolingbroke. He met his nephew at Berkeley Castle and acknowledged that resistance was futile. The Regent of England had gone over to the rebels. It was a devastating blow to Richard's cause. With York's submission, the royal government effectively ceased to function. Bolingbroke was now the master of England. Bolingbroke marched south, gathering supporters as he went. Town after town opened its gates to him. Noble after noble joined his cause. The speed of his progress was remarkable. Within a few weeks, he controlled most of the kingdom. Richard's carefully constructed regime had collapsed like a house of cards. The news of Bolingbroke's invasion reached Richard in Ireland. The king was shocked and furious. He had not expected such a challenge. He had thought his position was secure. The seizure of the Lancastrian estates had been a calculated risk, but Richard had believed he could get away with it. He was wrong. Richard prepared to return to England immediately. But the winds were against him. His fleet could not sail. Days turned into weeks as the king waited helplessly in Ireland. Every day of delay strengthened Bolingbroke and weakened Richard. The king's frustration must have been immense. He was watching his kingdom slip away and could do nothing to stop it. Richard finally landed at Milford Haven in Wales in late July. He had hoped to find support among the Welsh, who had traditionally been loyal to the crown. Wales was also close to the Lancastrian heartland of Chester, where Richard had cultivated a personal following. But the situation was worse than he had feared. Most of Richard's army had dispersed during the long delay in Ireland. The soldiers had grown tired of waiting and had gone home. The nobles who had accompanied Richard to Ireland had either fled or were preparing to switch sides. The king found himself with only a handful of loyal followers. His military position was hopeless. Richard retreated to North Wales, hoping to rally support. He moved from castle to castle, seeking safety and looking for allies. He sent messages to his supporters, urging them to come to his aid, but few responded. The kingdom had already decided that Richard's time was over. No one wanted to risk their lives for a losing cause. The king eventually reached Conwy Castle, a mighty fortress on the North Welsh coast. Here he paused to consider his options. He still had a small group of loyal followers. He still held the title of king. Perhaps something could be salvaged from the disaster. Perhaps negotiations might preserve his throne, even if he had to share power with Bolingbroke. The Earl of Northumberland came to Conwy to negotiate. He brought promises from Bolingbroke. If Richard would surrender peacefully, he would be allowed to remain king. Bolingbroke wanted only his inheritance and the punishment of Richard's evil counsellors. The king would retain his crown and his dignity. These promises were lies, but Richard believed them. He had no choice but to believe them. Richard left Conwy Castle and rode to meet Bolingbroke. He travelled with a small escort, trusting in the promises that had been made. But as he rode through the Welsh countryside, he realised he had been deceived. Northumberland's men surrounded him. He was a prisoner. The promises of safety and continued kingship were worthless. The meeting between Richard and Bolingbroke took place at Flint Castle. It was a dramatic confrontation between the reigning king and the man who would replace him. Richard was brought before Bolingbroke like a captive. The roles had been reversed. The king who had once humiliated Bolingbroke was now at his mercy. The exact words exchanged at Flint Castle are not known with certainty. Different chroniclers give different accounts. But the meaning of the encounter was clear. Richard had lost. Bolingbroke had won. The transfer of power was about to take place. England would have a new king. Bolingbroke brought Richard to London. The fallen king was lodged in the Tower of London, the great fortress that had witnessed so many dramatic moments in English history. Richard had sheltered in the tower during the Peasants' Revolt. Now he was imprisoned there. The wheel of fortune had turned completely. The question of what to do with Richard was complicated. Bolingbroke had claimed he wanted only his inheritance, but events had moved far beyond that. Richard could not simply be restored to power. He had too many enemies. He would seek revenge on those who had opposed him. No one who had supported Bolingbroke would be safe if Richard remained king. The solution was deposition. Richard would be removed from the throne and replaced by Bolingbroke. This was a drastic step. English kings ruled by divine right. They were God's anointed representatives on earth. Removing a king was not just a political act, but a religious one. It raised troubling questions about the nature of royal authority. The precedent of Edward II was invoked. Richard's great-grandfather had been deposed in 1327. He had been forced to abdicate in favour of his son, Edward III. The same procedure could be used against Richard. He would be pressured to resign his crown voluntarily. This would give the transfer of power a veneer of legitimacy. Richard was brought before Assembly at Westminster on September 29th, 1399. He was presented with a document listing his crimes and failures. He was accused of tyranny, of breaking his coronation oath, of ruling for his own benefit rather than the good of the realm. The charges were extensive and damning. Richard agreed to abdicate. Whether he did so voluntarily or under duress is debated by historians. The official account says he resigned freely and even cheerfully. But Richard was a prisoner surrounded by his enemies. He had no real choice. His abdication was a formality that gave legal cover to what was essentially a coup. The abdication document was read to Parliament on September 30th. Richard renounced his crown and released his subjects from their oaths of loyalty. He acknowledged that he was unworthy to rule. He asked that Henry Bolingbroke succeed him as king. The assembled lords and commons accepted the abdication and acclaimed Henry as their new monarch. Henry Bolingbroke became King Henry IV of England. He was crowned at Westminster Abbey on October 13th, 1399. The ceremony was magnificent, designed to emphasise the legitimacy of the new regime. Henry claimed the throne by right of descent from Henry III, by right of conquest, and by the free choice of the people. He wanted to establish his rule on the firmest possible foundations. Richard's reign was over. He had ruled England for 22 years, from the age of 10 to the age of 32. He had faced rebellions, invasions, and constitutional crises. He had shown courage at Smithfield and cruelty in his revenge on the appellants. He had patronised the arts and pursued peace with France. He had loved Anne of Bohemia and mourned her death. Now all of that was finished. He was no longer a king but a prisoner. The fall of Richard II was a watershed moment in English history. It established the principle that a king could be removed if he ruled badly. It showed that the nobility and Parliament had the power to change the succession. It planted seeds of conflict that would eventually grow into the Wars of the Roses. The consequences of 1399 would echo through English history for generations. Richard himself was taken to Pontefract Castle in Yorkshire. He would spend the remaining months of his life as a prisoner. His fate was sealed. He had lost everything: his crown, his freedom, his future. The boy who had faced down the rebels at Smithfield, the young king who had dreamed of absolute power, was now a captive, awaiting whatever end his enemies chose for him. The final months of Richard's life were spent in captivity. After his deposition, he was moved from the Tower of London to more remote locations. His captors wanted him far from London, far from anyone who might try to rescue him. The former king was a dangerous symbol. As long as he lived, he was a potential rallying point for those who opposed the new regime. Richard was first taken to Leeds Castle in Kent. This was a temporary arrangement while more permanent accommodations were prepared. He was then moved to Pontefract Castle in Yorkshire, a strong fortress in the heart of Lancastrian territory. Here he would spend his final days, cut off from the world he had once ruled. Pontefract Castle was a grim place for a fallen king. The fortress was cold and forbidding. Richard was kept under close guard, with few comforts and little company. The contrast with his former life could not have been greater. He had once presided over the most magnificent court in Europe. Now he was a prisoner in a northern castle, forgotten by most of the world. The new king, Henry IV, faced a difficult decision about what to do with Richard. Keeping him alive was dangerous. There would always be plots to restore him. There would always be people who considered Henry a usurper and Richard the rightful king. But killing Richard was also problematic. It would confirm the worst accusations against Henry. It would make him a regicide, a king killer. A conspiracy to restore Richard emerged in January 1400. A group of nobles who had been loyal to Richard planned to seize Henry during the Epiphany celebrations at Windsor. They would kill the usurper and restore the rightful king. The plot was discovered before it could be carried out. The conspirators were captured and executed, but the episode showed how dangerous Richard remained. The failed conspiracy sealed Richard's fate. Henry could not afford to let him live. As long as Richard breathed, there would be plots and rebellions. The former king had to die, but Henry wanted to avoid the appearance of murder. He wanted Richard's death to seem natural, or at least ambiguous. Richard died at Pontefract Castle in February 1400. The exact circumstances of his death are uncertain. The official story was that he starved himself to death, refusing to eat after learning of the failed conspiracy. This account portrayed Richard as choosing his own end, absolving Henry of direct responsibility, but most historians believe Richard was murdered. He may have been starved to death deliberately, denied food until he died. He may have been killed more directly, perhaps smothered or beaten. The truth will never be known with certainty. What is certain is that Richard's death was convenient for Henry, and that Henry had both motive and opportunity to arrange it. Richard was 33 years old when he died. He had been king for 22 years and a prisoner for less than 6 months. His life had been marked by dramatic highs and lows. He had shown courage and cruelty, wisdom and folly. He had been loved and hated, admired and despised. Now he was gone, and England had to reckon with his legacy. Henry IV displayed Richard's body publicly to prove that he was dead. The corpse was brought to London and shown at St. Paul's Cathedral. Thousands of people filed past to see the former king. Henry wanted to eliminate any doubt about Richard's death. He wanted to prevent rumours that Richard had escaped and was waiting to reclaim his throne. Richard was initially buried at King's Langley in Hertfordshire, a relatively modest location for a former king. Henry did not want to honour Richard with a grand tomb in Westminster Abbey. That would have elevated the man he had overthrown. King's Langley was respectable, but not glorious. It was a burial fit for a deposed king, not a reigning one. Richard's body was eventually moved to Westminster Abbey by Henry V in 1413. The new king wanted to make peace with the past. He gave Richard a proper royal burial beside Anne of Bohemia, fulfilling Richard's wish to be buried with his beloved first wife. The magnificent tomb that Richard had commissioned years earlier finally received his remains. The tomb of Richard and Anne in Westminster Abbey is a masterpiece of medieval art. It shows the royal couple lying side by side, their hands clasped together. The effigies are beautifully carved, capturing something of their appearance in life. Richard wears his crown and royal robes. Anne wears the costume of a queen. They look peaceful, united in death as they were in life. Richard's legacy was contested from the moment of his death. His supporters remembered him as a legitimate king, unjustly overthrown. His enemies remembered him as a tyrant who deserved his fate. These competing narratives would shape how Richard was remembered for centuries. The Lancastrian kings who followed Henry IV had an interest in portraying Richard negatively. They needed to justify the deposition and the change of dynasty. Official histories emphasized Richard's tyranny, his extravagance, and his unfitness to rule. They portrayed Henry's seizure of power as a necessary correction, a restoration of good government. But not everyone accepted this narrative. Some people continued to believe that Richard was the rightful king, and that the Lancastrians were usurpers. Rumours circulated that Richard had not really died, that he had escaped from Pontefract and was living in Scotland. These rumours persisted for years, causing problems for the new dynasty. The question of Richard's mental state has fascinated historians. Some have suggested that he suffered from some form of mental illness, perhaps a personality disorder or even schizophrenia. His erratic behaviour in the later years of his reign, his grandiose claims, and his vindictive cruelty have all been cited as evidence. But diagnosing historical figures is difficult and speculative. We cannot know what was happening in Richard's mind. Other historians have argued that Richard's behaviour was rational, if extreme. He had been traumatised by the events of 1386 to 1388. He had seen his friends killed and his power stripped away. His later actions can be understood as an attempt to prevent such humiliation from ever happening again. He sought absolute power because he had learned how dangerous it was to be weak. Richard's conception of kingship was central to his reign and his downfall. He believed that kings were God's representatives on earth, answerable to no one but God. He thought that royal authority should be absolute and unquestioned. These ideas were not unique to Richard, but he held them with particular intensity. They brought him into conflict with nobles and parliament, who believed that even kings had limits. The constitutional implications of Richard's deposition were profound. It established that a king could be removed if he ruled badly. It showed that the nobility and parliament had the power to judge a king and find him wanting. These principles would be invoked again in later centuries, most notably during the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution. Richard's cultural legacy was more positive than his political one. His patronage of the arts produced lasting achievements. The Wilton diptych remains one of the treasures of medieval painting. Westminster Hall, with its magnificent hammer-beam roof, still stands as a monument to his reign. Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, written during Richard's time, became a cornerstone of English literature. The English language itself benefited from Richard's reign. The growing use of English at court and in official documents helped establish the language's prestige. Richard was the first English king since the Norman conquest to have a tomb inscription in English. This symbolic choice reflected the rising status of the vernacular language. Richard's relationship with Anne of Bohemia remained one of the most touching aspects of his story. Their genuine love for each other stood out in an age of arranged marriages. Richard's grief at Anne's death was extreme but also deeply human. His wish to be buried beside her, eventually fulfilled, showed the depth of his attachment. In an otherwise troubled reign, this love story provided a note of tenderness. The Wars of the Roses, which devastated England in the 15th century, had their roots in Richard's deposition. The Lancastrian claim to the throne was never fully accepted by everyone. The descendants of those Richard had wronged nursed their grievances. Eventually, the House of York would challenge the House of Lancaster for the crown. The conflict that began in 1399 would not be fully resolved until 1485. Shakespeare's play, Richard II, written about 200 years after the events it depicts, shaped how later generations understood the king. Shakespeare portrayed Richard as a poetic, sensitive figure, unsuited for the harsh realities of medieval politics. The play's famous speeches gave Richard a eloquence he may not have possessed in life. But Shakespeare also showed Richard's flaws: his vanity, his poor judgment, his inability to understand his subjects. The historical Richard was more complex than any single portrayal can capture. He was capable of great courage, as he showed at Smithfield during the Peasants' Revolt. He was capable of great cruelty, as he showed in his revenge on the Lord's Appellant. He was a patron of beauty, who surrounded himself with magnificent art. He was a tyrant who crushed those who opposed him. He loved deeply and hated fiercely. He dreamed of absolute power and lost everything. Richard's story is ultimately a tragedy. A boy became king too young, burdened with the responsibilities he was not ready to bear. He faced challenges that would have tested any ruler. He made mistakes that cost him his throne and his life. But he also showed qualities that deserve recognition. His courage, his cultural achievements, and his capacity for love are part of his legacy alongside his failures. The reign of Richard II marks the end of an era in English history. The Plantagenet dynasty, which had ruled England since 1154, effectively ended with his deposition. The House of Lancaster that replaced it was a branch of the same family, but the direct line of succession had been broken. England would never be quite the same. Richard's grave in Westminster Abbey remains a place of pilgrimage for those interested in medieval history. Visitors can see the tomb he shares with Anne, their effigies lying peacefully together. They can reflect on the dramatic life and tragic death of one of England's most fascinating kings. The story of Richard II continues to captivate us more than 600 years after his death. As we come to the end of our journey through the life of Richard II, it is worth pausing to reflect on what his story means. Richard's reign was filled with drama, conflict, and tragedy. It offers lessons about power, about human nature, and about the fragility of political order. These lessons remain relevant today, centuries after Richard's death. Richard came to the throne as a child, thrust into a role he was not prepared to fill. This was not his fault. He did not choose to be king at 10 years old. He did not choose to be surrounded by ambitious uncles and scheming nobles. He inherited a kingdom at war, a treasury depleted, and a society still recovering from the Black Death. These were challenges that would have tested any ruler. The Peasants Revolt of 1381 was the defining moment of Richard's early reign. His courage at Smithfield, when he rode forward to face the rebel host after Wat Tyler's death, was genuinely heroic. A 14-year-old boy calmed a murderous crowd and prevented a massacre. This was leadership of the highest order. It suggested that Richard had the qualities needed to be a great king. But the aftermath of the revolt revealed a darker side of Richard's character. The promises he made to the rebels were quickly broken. The charters of freedom were revoked. The leaders of the revolt were hunted down and killed. Richard learned that promises made under duress need not be kept. He learned that the common people could be manipulated and deceived. These were dangerous lessons for a young king. The crisis of 1386 to 1388 was another turning point. The Lords Appellant humiliated Richard, killed his friends, and stripped him of power. The merciless Parliament was a trauma that Richard never forgot. He spent the next decade nursing his grievances, waiting for the moment when he could take revenge. When that moment came, he showed no mercy. Richard's revenge on the Appellants in 1397 was thorough and brutal. Arundel was executed. Warwick was imprisoned. Gloucester was murdered. The two younger Appellants, Bolingbroke and Mowbray, were exiled. Richard had destroyed his enemies, but in doing so he created new ones. His tyranny alienated even those who had supported him. The seeds of his downfall were sown in his moment of triumph. The seizure of the Lancastrian estates was Richard's fatal mistake. By taking Bolingbroke's inheritance, he threatened the property rights of every noble in England. If the king could seize one man's lands, he could seize anyone's. This was a threat that the nobility could not ignore. When Bolingbroke returned to reclaim his inheritance, he found widespread support. Richard had united his enemies against him. Richard's conception of kingship contributed to his downfall. He believed in absolute royal authority, answerable only to God. He thought that subjects should obey without question. He surrounded himself with ceremony and ritual that emphasized his majesty. But medieval England was not an absolute monarchy. Kings needed the cooperation of their nobles and their parliament. Richard's attempts to rule without this cooperation were doomed to fail. The contrast between Richard and his successor is instructive. Henry IV was a practical politician who understood the need for compromise. He worked with Parliament rather than against it. He rewarded his supporters and conciliated his opponents. He was not a great king, but he was a competent one. He survived challenges that would have destroyed a lesser man. Richard, for all his intelligence and courage, lacked this political skill. Richard's cultural achievements deserve recognition alongside his political failures. His court was a centre of artistic excellence. The works produced under his patronage enriched English culture for centuries. The Wilton diptych, Westminster Hall, and the literature of Chaucer and his contemporaries are lasting monuments to Richard's reign. In this realm, at least, Richard's legacy is positive. The love between Richard and Anne of Bohemia adds a human dimension to his story. Their marriage was a genuine partnership, rare in an age of political unions. Anne's death devastated Richard and may have contributed to his later instability. The tomb they share in Westminster Abbey is a touching memorial to their bond. It reminds us that even kings are human, capable of love and grief. Richard's story raises questions about the nature of kingship that remain relevant today. What makes a good ruler? How should power be exercised? What are the limits of authority? Richard believed that kings were above the law, accountable only to God. His subjects disagreed. The conflict between these views led to his deposition and death. Similar conflicts have played out throughout history, in different forms and different contexts. The deposition of Richard established important constitutional principles. It showed that a king could be removed if he ruled badly. It demonstrated the power of Parliament and the nobility to hold a king accountable. These principles would be invoked again in later centuries. The English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution both drew on the precedent of 1399. Richard's fall was a step toward constitutional monarchy. Richard's mental state in his later years remains a subject of debate. His erratic behaviour, his grandiose claims, and his vindictive cruelty have led some historians to suggest mental illness. Others see his actions as rational responses to the traumas he had experienced. We cannot know the truth with certainty, but we can recognise that Richard was a complex figure, shaped by his experiences and his circumstances. The tragedy of Richard II is ultimately a human tragedy. A man with genuine abilities was destroyed by his own flaws. His courage was undermined by his vindictiveness. His intelligence was clouded by his pride. His love of beauty was accompanied by a love of power that knew no limits. He had the potential to be a great king, but became a tyrant instead. Richard's story also reminds us of the role of chance in history. If the winds had been favourable, Richard might have returned from Ireland in time to confront Bolingbroke. If the conspiracy of January 1400 had succeeded, Richard might have been restored to his throne. If Anne of Bohemia had lived longer, her moderating influence might have prevented Richard's descent into tyranny. History is full of such contingencies. Small changes in circumstances can lead to vastly different outcomes. The weather that trapped Richard in Ireland was perhaps the most consequential stroke of bad luck in his life. For weeks his fleet could not sail. The winds that should have carried him home refused to cooperate. Each day of delay strengthened Bolingbroke and weakened Richard. By the time the king finally reached Wales, his cause was already lost. A change in the weather might have changed the course of English history. Richard's decision to go to Ireland in 1399 remains puzzling. He had just completed his campaign of revenge against the Lords Appellants. He had made powerful enemies and alienated much of the nobility. This was precisely the wrong moment to leave England. Yet Richard went anyway. Perhaps he underestimated the danger. Perhaps he overestimated his own security. Perhaps he simply wanted to escape the tensions of his kingdom for a while. The speed of Richard's fall was remarkable. In just a few weeks he went from being the undisputed King of England to being a prisoner in the Tower of London. His carefully constructed regime collapsed almost overnight. The nobles who had supported him abandoned him without a fight. The army he had brought to Ireland melted away. It was as if his entire reign had been built on sand. This rapid collapse suggests that Richard's power was more fragile than it appeared. He had ruled through fear rather than loyalty. He had rewarded his friends lavishly, but had made too many enemies. When the moment of crisis came, there was no reservoir of goodwill to sustain him. The people who might have fought for a beloved king had no desire to die for a tyrant. Richard's treatment of the Lancastrian inheritance was the immediate cause of his downfall. By seizing Bolingbroke's lands, he threatened the property rights of every noble in England. This was a fundamental attack on the social order. The nobility depended on secure inheritance to maintain their power and status. If the king could take one man's lands on a whim, no one was safe. Richard had given his enemies a cause that united them against him. The role of the Percy family in Richard's fall deserves attention. The Earl of Northumberland and his son Hotspur were among the first to join Bolingbroke. Their support was crucial to his success. The Percys were powerful lords of the north, with military resources that could tip the balance in any conflict. Their decision to back Bolingbroke rather than Richard was a turning point. It showed that even the greatest nobles had lost faith in the king. The Percys would later turn against Henry IV as well. They felt they had not been adequately rewarded for their support. Hotspur led a rebellion in 1403 and was killed at the Battle of Shrewsbury. The Earl of Northumberland continued to plot against Henry until his own death in 1408. The men who had helped make Henry king became his enemies. Power in medieval England was always precarious. Richard's surrender at Conwy Castle was a moment of profound humiliation. The king who had once commanded armies and dispensed justice was now a fugitive, hiding in a Welsh fortress. He had been deceived by false promises and trapped by his enemies. The man who had prided himself on his majesty and dignity was reduced to begging for his life. It was a complete reversal of fortune. The scene at Flint Castle, where Richard met Bolingbroke as a captive, has inspired artists and writers for centuries. The fallen king confronting the man who would have replaced him. The transfer of power from one dynasty to another. The end of one era and the beginning of another. It was a moment heavy with historical significance. Shakespeare would later dramatise it in some of his most memorable verses. Richard's abdication was technically voluntary, but everyone understood the reality. He was a prisoner surrounded by his enemies. He had no army, no allies, no hope of rescue. His only choice was between abdication and death. Under these circumstances, his resignation of the crown was a formality. It gave legal cover to what was essentially a seizure of power by force. The legitimacy of Henry IV's claim to the throne was always questionable. He was not the next in line according to strict hereditary succession. The Earl of March, descended from an older son of Edward III, had a stronger claim by blood. But March was a child, and Henry was a grown man with an army. In medieval politics, possession was often more important than legal rights. Henry tried to bolster his claim through multiple justifications. He claimed descent from Henry III through his mother's line. He claimed the throne by right of conquest. He claimed that he had been chosen by the people in Parliament. These overlapping claims were meant to provide legitimacy from different angles, but they also revealed the weakness of any single claim. Henry was king because he had seized power, not because he had an unquestionable right to it. The consequences of Richard's deposition extended far beyond his own lifetime. The precedent established in 1399 would be invoked again and again. If one king could be deposed, so could another. The sanctity of royal authority had been breached. Future generations would remember that kings could be removed and would act on that knowledge. The Wars of the Roses, which devastated England in the 15th century, grew directly from the events of 1399. The Yorkist claim to the throne was based on descent from the Earl of March, who had been passed over when Henry IV seized power. The Lancastrians defended their right to rule. The conflict between these houses produced decades of civil war, multiple changes of dynasty, and the deaths of thousands. Richard himself became a symbol in these later conflicts. The Yorkists portrayed him as a martyred king, unjustly overthrown by Lancastrian usurpers. They used his memory to delegitimize their enemies. Richard's body was moved to Westminster Abbey, partly to honour him and partly to make a political point. The dead king remained a factor in the struggles of the living. The Tudor dynasty, which finally ended the Wars of the Roses, had its own reasons to remember Richard. Henry VII, the first Tudor king, defeated Richard III at Bosworth Field in 1485. But the Tudors were descended from John of Gaunt through an illegitimate line. Their claim to the throne was even weaker than that of the Lancastrians. They needed to justify the removal of kings while also asserting the sanctity of their own rule. Shakespeare's play about Richard II was written during the reign of Elizabeth I, the last Tudor monarch. The play was politically sensitive because it depicted the deposition of a legitimate king. Elizabeth herself reportedly said that she was Richard II, recognising the parallel between her situation and his. The play was censored, with the deposition scene removed from early printed editions. Even 200 years later, Richard's fall remained a dangerous subject. The historical sources for Richard's reign are extensive but problematic. The chroniclers who wrote about him had their own biases and agendas. Those who wrote under Lancastrian rule tended to portray Richard negatively. They emphasised his tyranny and justified his deposition. Those who sympathised with Richard told a different story. Sorting out the truth from the propaganda is a challenge that historians continue to face. The Kirkstall Chronicle and the Chronicle of Adam of Usk provide valuable contemporary accounts of Richard's reign. Thomas Walsingham, a monk of St Albans, wrote extensively about the period. Jean Froissart, the famous French chronicler, also covered Richard's reign, though his perspective was that of an outsider. These sources offer different viewpoints and must be read critically. Archaeological and artistic evidence supplements the written sources. The Wilton Diptych provides insight into Richard's religious devotion and his conception of kingship. His tomb in Westminster Abbey shows how he wished to be remembered. The buildings he constructed, particularly Westminster Hall, demonstrate his architectural ambitions. These physical remains bring us closer to the man behind the historical accounts. Richard's personality remains elusive, despite the wealth of sources. He was clearly intelligent and cultured. He had a strong sense of his own dignity and authority. He could be charming when he wished and cruel when crossed. He formed intense attachments and bitter enmities. He was capable of both courage and cowardice, wisdom and folly. He was, in short, a complex human being, not easily reduced to simple categories. The question of whether Richard was a good king or a bad one does not have a simple answer. By some measures, he was successful. He maintained peace with France for most of his reign. He patronised the arts and presided over a cultural flowering. He showed genuine concern for Ireland and tried to address its problems. He was not incompetent or lazy. He worked hard at the business of kingship. But Richard also failed in fundamental ways. He could not maintain the trust and loyalty of his nobles. He allowed his desire for revenge to override his political judgment. He pushed his conception of royal authority to extremes that his subjects could not accept. He made enemies when he should have made friends. His reign ended in disaster, with himself deposed and murdered, and his kingdom plunged into uncertainty. The balance of Richard's reign tilts toward failure. A king's primary duty is to maintain order and pass on his kingdom to his successor. Richard failed at both. His tyranny created disorder, and his lack of an heir left the succession uncertain. The chaos that followed his deposition was partly his responsibility. He had created the conditions that made it possible. Yet we should not judge Richard too harshly. He faced challenges that would have tested any ruler. He came to the throne as a child and had to navigate the treacherous politics of a royal minority. He was surrounded by ambitious relatives who sought to control him. He experienced trauma that would have affected anyone. His failures were real, but they were human failures, understandable if not excusable.